We often come across organizations, ones that seem to have a pretty clear mission on the surface, maybe studying social trends or advocating for certain freedoms.
Right.
But what happens when you start digging a bit deeper? You peel back the layers and suddenly find this, well, much more complex history underneath, maybe even a surprising one.
It happens more often than you'd think, doesn't it? How something appearing quite neutral can actually have these really significant ideological roots.
Yeah,
It really makes you look beyond just the official presentation.
absolutely. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in this deep dive. You might remember we mentioned CESNUR, the Centro Studi Nuove Religioni, before.
Briefly.
Well, we've got this dossier by Luigi Corvaglia now, and it gives this fascinating look into the actual origins, the genesis of CESNUR.
Okay.
And for you listening, if you want to get a handle on where groups like this come from and what their background might imply without getting totally bogged down in details, well, that's our aim.
Extracting the key insights.
Exactly, those aha moments. And this part of Corvaglia's work really focuses on how CESNUR started, building on some of that earlier context.
So where does this story kick off? It sounds like there's a key figure involved.
There is indeed. The starting point seems to be a man named Yves Guérin-Serac.
Okay.
Now, back in 2006, there was this conference in Spain, the Foro Espiritual. Guérin-Serac shows up, presented as an expert on religious matters.
Seems straightforward enough. A religious expert at a spiritual forum.
Right. But here's the twist. His real name was Yves Guilloux, and he wasn't just any expert. He was the founder of a terrorist organization called Agenter Press.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a contrast. Someone with that kind of background presented as an authority on religion.
Exactly. It immediately makes you wonder what's really going on.
Yeah, suggests a much deeper, maybe hidden agenda.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And Agenter Press, from what the dossier says, this wasn't some small, isolated group.
Yeah.
It was funded by the secret police in Salazar's Portugal. There was an authoritarian regime, remember?
Right. PIDE, I think.
That's the one. And it apparently had links to Western intelligence agencies, too. It acted as a kind of hub for right-wing subversion between, say, the mid-60s and mid-70s.
Subversion covering what exactly?
Well, things like involvement in terrorism in Italy via connections to the neo-fascist group Ordine Nuovo.
Ordine Nuovo, linked to the Piazza Fontana bombing.
Yes, precisely. And also involvement in Operation Condor down in South America.
Okay, so this is major stuff. International destabilization, political suppression, terrorism.
Pretty much. We're talking about a network involved in serious violence on a global scale, especially during the Cold War.
And the founder just pops up years later as a religious expert. That's jarring, to say the least.
That's stranger. In 2002, this same Guérin-Serac was at a meeting for the Women's Federation for World Peace.
Which is linked to the Unification Church, right?
That's right. Now, contrast that with how Vincenzo Vinciguerra, he was a member of Ordine Nuovo, and another group, Avanguardia Nazionale, described him.
What did he say?
Vinciguerra called Guérin-Serac, or Ralph, as he knew him, a fundamentalist Catholic who truly believed violence was, well, legitimate.
Legitimate for what purpose?
To preserve Christian civilization. That's quite a different picture from someone participating in interfaith meetings, isn't it?
Absolutely. It raises huge questions about authenticity. Was this genuine religious belief, or was religion just a tool, a cover for something else?
That seems to be a core question here. The dossier then dives into what it calls the traditionalist matrix.
The ideological source, basically.
Yeah, the environment that kind of bred this way of thinking. It points to links between radical Catholic traditionalism and violence, using the OAS as a key example.
The OAS organization, Armée Secrète, from the Algerian War.
That's the one. Their whole French Algeria or death thing, their terrorist attacks, even trying to assassinate de Gaulle.
And their justification for violence. That's crucial here, isn't it?
Extremely. The dossier mentions how some Catholic military circles justified torture and killing based on interpretations of Aristotle, Aquinas, Augustine.
The doctrine of double effect, perhaps, where harm's okay if the main intention is supposedly good.
Exactly that. A way to rationalize extreme actions to protect what they saw as a sacred traditional order.
And Guérin-Serac was involved with the OAS.
He was. And the suggestion is he bought into this logic that mass violence could be justified to defend traditional Christian society.
Chilling.
This connects to the idea of subversion, which was a big deal for Jean Husset, founder of La Cité Catholique.
Another traditionalist group. influential with the OAS.
Very influential. For Uset, subversion was basically anything that challenged what he saw as God's plan, the natural law, the Christian order. He traced it all back to the French Revolution.
So the enemy isn't just political.
Right.
It's an entire worldview seen as anti-divine.
Right, and that justifies extreme defense measures. This fight against subversion even included defending the white presence in Africa in the remaining European colonies.
And this ideology wasn't just confined to France or Algeria.
No, it spread. In Brazil, you had Plinio Correa de Oliveira and his organization, TFP Tradition, Family and Property.
TFP, okay.
They basically took Osset's idea of subversion and called it revolution. De Oliveira believed Christianity had been declining since the 15th century because of things like egalitarianism and liberalism.
He wanted to restore
A hierarchical, sacred, anti-egalitarian, anti-liberal Christian civilization. That was the goal.
It's fascinating how these ideas pop up in different places, France, Brazil, but share that same core traditionalist reaction.
And TFP wasn't just talking. They were involved in reactionary politics in Latin America, supporting the coup in Brazil in '64, the coup in Chile in '73,
Pinochet.
supporting Pinochet's regime, yes.
Yeah.
Using the same logic as the OAS Catholics that fighting communism justified, well, pretty much anything, including human rights abuses.
And there were links to outside forces, CIA maybe?
Allegations of CIA support for TFP in Chile, yes. And connections to the World Anti-Communist League, WACL.
So a global network of anti-communist traditionalist groups.
Pretty much. And despite some differences between Osset and de Oliveira personally, their core ideas found a home together in Italy, in an organization called Alleanza Cattolica.
Okay, so Alleanza Cattolica becomes a kind of meeting point for these different streams of thought?
Seems like it. And this loops back to Agenda Press.
Right, Karen Sarek's group.
After the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in '74, Agenda Press got exposed. It wasn't just a press agency, it was an international hub for subversion.
Doing what specifically?
Espionage, training mercenaries, infiltrating revolutionary movements, you name it. It had an espionage arm linked to PADE, the CIA, the Gehlen network in Germany.
Gehlen Network, post-war German intelligence using former Nazis, right?
Oh, that's the one. It also had recruitment and training centers for sabotage attacks, especially in the Third World.
Yeah.
And political military arms called Ordre et Tradition and OACI.
So Agenda Press was basically the action arm for this ideology, fighting subversion with dirty tricks and clandestine ops.
Looks that way. And cooperating with Western security services for the really dirty operations. The dossier even mentions the John Birch Society in the U.S.
A far-right group.
as a possible channel for U.S. support. Kind of an early version of some conservative think tanks we see later.
And its connection to Italy. You mentioned Ordine Nuovo.
Yes, crucially, Agenda Press is linked to the strategy of tension in Italy. Specifically, the Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan, 1969.
A major, horrific event.
Absolutely. Investigations by Judge Salvini, rulings by Italy's highest court, they implicated Ordine Nuovo.
Which had proven ties to Garin Serac.
Documented ties, yes.
Yeah.
And Ordine Nuovo itself was reportedly very close to parts of the Italian Secret Service.
This strategy of tension, it sounds like these networks weren't just philosophical, they were actively trying to manipulate politics through violence.
That's the implication. And Ordine Nuovo itself had this anti-modern, hierarchical, sort of spiritualist culture.
Right.
And through groups like the OAS and Agenda Press, you see European neo-fascism making a shift.
A shift how?
From being maybe anti-American and anti-Soviet to becoming defenders of the West, of Atlanticism, all as part of this fight against subversion.
Okay, so that brings us back to the Italian connection, Alleanza Cattolica.
Exactly. Founded in 1968 by Giovanni Cantoni and Agostino Sanfratello, they were very critical of the Italian risorgimento, the unification of Italy in the 19th century.
Why?
They saw it as part of that same liberal revolutionary trend from the French Revolution. Their thing was promoting revisionist history, defending Catholic uprisings against those liberal movements.
Rewriting history to fit the ideology.
Seems like it. And look at some of the people involved. Agostino Sanfratello, the co-founder, had connections to Franco Freda, a known neo-fascist terrorist.
Wow.
Sanfratello also mentored Roberto Fiore.
Fiore, later involved with Terza Posizione, Forza Nuova, extremist groups.
The very same. And Fiore reportedly got protection from MI6 British intelligence for a time.
This network seems incredibly tangled. Extremists, intelligence agencies.
It certainly appears complex. Even Piero Vassallo, who became president of Forza Nuova, has defended Nazi ideology. And interestingly, Alleanza Cattolica has lawyers among its members, like Alfredo Mantovano,
Mantovano, isn't he currently?
currently an undersecretary of state in Italy, with responsibility for the secret services.
Okay. That's significant. These aren't just fringe connections then.
But the key figure connecting all this for our story, for the CESNUR origins, is Massimo Introvigne.
Ah, Introvigne. He's central to CESNUR today.
He joined Alleanza Cattolica way back in 1972, rose through the ranks, eventually becoming its de facto leader, the Reggente Vicario. He even set up a Center for Counter-Revolutionary Studies within AC.
So deeply embedded in this traditionalist, counter-revolutionary milieu.
Completely. Alleanza Cattolica frames its work through the social doctrine of the Church, but specifically interpreted through natural morality and heavily influenced by Plinio Correa de Oliveira's big book, Revolution and Counter-Revolution.
The TFP founder.
Right. And Introvigne himself has apparently acknowledged that AC sits ideologically somewhere between Osset and de Oliveira.
So Alleanza Cattolica, with Introvigne rising within it, acts as this bridge. It connects the world of OAS and Agenter Press, the sort of militant, subversive side, with the more ideologically driven, potentially CIA-linked world of TFP.
That seems to be the picture the dossier paints. It's where these different strands of traditionalist thought and action come together.
Okay. So what happens next? We're getting closer to CESNUR's founding.
We are. In the late 70s, early 80s, TFP started running into trouble. Scandals, criticisms about indoctrination, accusations of being cult-like.
I remember hearing about issues in Venezuela, Brazil.
Exactly. Bans, condemnation from bishops' conferences. TFP's response was interesting.
How so?
They started pushing back hard, claiming that brainwashing was just a myth, a fabrication cooked up by a conspiracy they called the anti-cult movement.
Framing the critics as the problem, a common tactic.
And around this time, TFP also starts pivoting, shifting its focus more towards American conservatism.
Why the U.S.?
They apparently saw Christian America as the main counter-revolutionary force against secularism in Europe, and what they termed the Marxization of the Catholic Church in Latin America.
A strategic realignment, finding new allies.
Yeah, they started collaborating with figures like Paul Weyrich, the Council for National Policy, CNP, in the U.S., connecting with the Atlas Network. These pro-free market Christian groups often linked to U.S. foreign policy objectives.
Okay, so TFP is adapting, networking with the American conservative movement.
And it's right in the middle of this shift, this context, in 1988.
Let me guess.
That Massimo Introvigne of Alleanza Cattolica found CESNUR, the Centro Studi Nuove Religioni.
There it is. So CESNUR emerges directly from this milieu, from Alleanza Cattolica, which itself is tied into TFP, Osset, Agenter Press, this whole complex history.
That's the connection being drawn. CESNUR presents itself as an independent research center studying new religious movements.
But its founder and key figures come directly from Alleanza Cattolica, with its deep counter-revolutionary roots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the criticism has always been about its neutrality because of these affiliations. Introvigne himself, in a 1993 statement cited in the dossier.
What did he say?
He apparently explicitly linked CESNUR's creation and work to the Catholic counter-revolutionary school of Osset and Correa de Oliveira. He framed it as part of the dramatic struggle between evangelization and anti-evangelization.
Or, in their terms, revolution and counter-revolution.
Precisely.
Wow. That's quite an admission. It really challenges the whole neutral research center image. It suggests CESNUR sees its work through this very specific ideological lens.
And in practice, CESNUR's become known as a major defender of religious freedom, often championing groups labeled as cults by the so-called anti-cult movement.
And promoting the idea that things like spiritual manipulation or coercive persuasion, they don't really exist or are exaggerated.
Often, yes. Which brings us back to that paradox we noted earlier. Someone from a staunchly traditionalist Catholic background seeming to embrace almost any religious group, no matter how controversial.
It makes more sense, perhaps, if the goal isn't ecumenism, but fighting the common enemy, secularism, modernism, liberalism, the forces of revolution.
That aligns with the view of Jeffrey M. Bale, an expert on extremism. He describes CESNUR as having a sub rosa, a hidden agenda.
Which is?
To defend extremist, totalitarian, anti-democratic groups from criticism and to push back against secular humanism, liberalism, modernism. Bale apparently called it perhaps the most important case of this kind of organization.
High praise or perhaps high concern, depending on your perspective.
And Luigi Corvaglia, the author of the dossier we're drawing on, he takes it a step further.
How so?
He suggests CESNUR is basically the cognitive version of Agenter Press.
What do you mean?
Where Agenter Press was a control room for, physical and psychological warfare against communism and leftist movements. Corvallis sees CESNUR as a control room for a cultural and cognitive influence war.
A war against secularism.
Essentially, yes. A battle for minds fought through research, publications, conferences, influencing policy debates about religious freedom.
And Introvigne himself still targets secularism.
Oh, yes. He apparently continues to criticize French secularism, laïcité, viewing it as the toxic legacy of the Jacobin terror during the French Revolution.
And sees modern anti-cult groups like Miviludes in France or Fécris in Europe
As the heirs of that Jacobin terror, the modern face of the revolution he's dedicated to countering.
It all seems to fit that counter-revolutionary framework he admitted to back in '93.
It does. And then you get these seemingly bizarre incidents, like Introvigne apparently visiting a satanic temple.
Which seems utterly contradictory for a Catholic traditionalist.
Unless the goal isn't about endorsing Satanism, but maybe about defending the absolute principle of religious freedom for everyone as a way to undermine secular restrictions on any religion, thereby advancing the broader counter-revolutionary cause against secularism itself, or perhaps just scholarly curiosity. It's ambiguous.
Definitely raises questions about strategy versus belief.
Okay, let's just pause and try to synthesize this. It's quite a journey we've traced. It really is. From Guérin Sirac, the OAS, the violence and subversion of Agenter Press,
Through the ideology of Ossa and de Oliveira, finding a home in Alianza Católica with Introvigne.
leading to TFP's pivot, and then finally the creation of CESNUR in 1988.
The key takeaway seems to be this potential ideological through line, a thread connecting radical traditionalism, Cold War anti-communist operations, and what presents itself as the neutral academic study of new religions.
The idea of a counter-revolution with a mask, as Corvallis might put it, where advocating for religious freedom might actually be serving a much broader, older, and less transparent ideological battle.
And for you listening, understanding this history, this complex web of connections, it really provides crucial context for interpreting organizations like CESNUR and the ongoing debates about religious freedom, cults, and secularism today.
It makes you question the surface narrative, doesn't it? Absolutely. Which leads us to that final thought for you to mull over. If we know about these deep historical and ideological roots, how does that change how we listen to and evaluate contemporary arguments about religious freedom?
Yeah, and what does it mean for public discourse when organizations presented as neutral research centers might actually have these profound, long-standing ideological commitments driving their work?
Definitely something to think about.